The canyon walls trembled with the voice of distant thunder, and somewhere high in the mountains, rain poured down like the sky had split open and refused to close. She had heard the roar growing louder for hours, a sound that started as a whisper and swelled into something alive, something hungry, and by the time Rose Campbell understood what was coming, the trail beneath her boots had already begun to dissolve into rivers of mud. The flood was rising, and she was alone. The afternoon sun had long vanished behind swollen clouds that pressed low against the ridgeline, turning the world into shades of gray and brown. Rose had been traveling for 3 days, following a narrow path that wound through the high desert of New Mexico territory, a route her late father had once described as treacherous in spring, but passable if you kept your wits. She had kept her wits, or so she believed, until the rain began to fall in sheets so thick she could barely see 10 feet ahead. Her horse had spooked an hour ago, rearing back when lightning split a juniper tree just yards from the trail. And in the chaos, the mare had torn free from Rose's grip and vanished into the storm. Now Rose stood on a crumbling ledge, her back pressed against wet stone, watching the water surge through the canyon below with a violence that stole her breath. The trail she had walked only minutes before was gone, swallowed by brown torrents that carried branches, stones, and debris in a churning mass that roared like a living beast. Her hands shook as she clutched the canvas satchel slung across her shoulder, the only possession she had managed to save. Inside it were letters from her mother, a small photograph of her family, and a silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother. Everything else, her supplies, her bedroll, her father's old rifle, had been strapped to the horse. She pressed herself tighter against the rock face, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the water climbed higher, inch by inch, creeping toward the narrow shelf where she stood. The rain pounded her shoulders and soaked through her wool coat. Her dark hair hung in heavy ropes against her neck, and her boots slipped on the slick stone beneath her feet. She tried to move laterally along the ledge, searching for higher ground, but the rock ended abruptly in a sheer drop, and the only path forward led straight into the rising flood. The canyon had seemed so peaceful when she first entered it that morning, the walls rising in striated layers of red and orange, ancient stone carved by centuries of patient water. Wildflowers had dotted the trail, small bursts of purple and yellow that nodded in the breeze, and she had paused more than once to admire the way sunlight filtered through the cottonwood trees that grew along the canyon floor. It had felt like a sanctuary, a hidden passage through the wilderness that offered both beauty and solitude. But now that same canyon had transformed into a trap. The walls that had seemed protective now felt like prison bars, and the water that had carved such beauty over the ages now rose with murderous intent. Panic clawed at her chest, sharp and cold, and for the first time since leaving Santa Fe, Rose felt the weight of her solitude. She had chosen this journey, had insisted on traveling alone despite the warnings, believing that independence meant refusing help. That strength was measured by how little you needed from others. Her mother had begged her to wait, to travel with a wagon train heading north, but Rose had been too stubborn, too eager to prove she could navigate the frontier without relying on anyone. She had inherited her father's restless spirit, that need to test herself against the wild places, to prove that a woman could be just as capable as any man when it came to reading trails and surviving hardship. Her father had died 6 months ago, thrown from his horse during a cattle drive. His neck broken in an instant, the loss had hollowed her out, leaving a grief so vast she sometimes forgot how to breathe. He had taught her everything: how to track game, how to read weather in the clouds, how to find water in country that looked bone dry. But he had also taught her pride, that stubborn belief that asking for help was a weakness. And now, as the water roared closer and the ledge beneath her began to crumble, she understood the cost of that pride. She opened her mouth and screamed, her voice raw and desperate. Swallowed almost instantly by the storm. "The flood's rising, someone help," she cried. Though she knew no one could hear her, knew that in this vast wilderness, her voice was nothing more than a whisper against the thunder, tears mixed with rain on her cheeks. And she felt the horrible certainty that this narrow shelf of stone would be the last place she ever stood. She thought of her mother waiting in Santa Fe, unaware that her daughter was about to be swept away. And the thought of that woman's grief, compounded by another loss, made Rose's chest tighten with a pain sharper than fear. The water below churned with such violence that it seemed to shake the very foundation of the canyon, sending tremors through the stone that vibrated up through Rose's boots. She watched a massive cottonwood tree tumble past, its roots torn free, its branches thrashing in the current like desperate arms. Behind it came a section of wooden fence, then what looked like part of a wagon wheel, evidence that somewhere upstream, the flood had already destroyed lives and homes. The debris crashed against the canyon walls with sounds like gunshots, splintering and breaking apart, and Rose knew that if she fell into that torrent, her body would be battered beyond recognition before anyone ever found it. But then, through the gray curtain of rain, she saw movement. A figure emerged on the opposite side of the canyon, barely visible through the downpour, moving with a steady, deliberate grace that seemed impossible in the chaos. Rose blinked, unsure if exhaustion had conjured a ghost. But the figure drew closer, navigating the flooded terrain with the ease of someone who belonged to this wild place. He was tall and lean, dressed in dark leather and rough woven cloth that clung to his frame, his long black hair tied back and streaming with water. Even from a distance, she could see the sharp focus in his movements, the way he read the land as if it spoke to him in a language only he understood. He stopped at the edge of the surging water, scanning the canyon with dark eyes that missed nothing. When his gaze found her, pressed against the rock and trembling, something shifted in his posture. He did not hesitate, did not weigh the danger or calculate the risk. He simply moved, stepping into the flood with a confidence that defied the chaos around him. Rose watched, breathless, as he crossed the torrent, using submerged stones and fallen logs as footholds, his balance perfect despite the water that crashed against his legs. The current pulled at him with hungry force, trying to drag him downstream, but he moved with a dancer's precision, shifting his weight at exactly the right moments, reading the water's rhythm as if he had been born to it. Twice the current nearly swept him away, surging up to his waist and threatening to topple him, but each time he adjusted, planting his foot against something solid beneath the surface. His body bent into the flow rather than fighting against it. She could see the concentration in his face now, the way his jaw set with determination, the careful calculation behind each step. He carried a coiled rope over one shoulder and a leather pack on his back, and as he moved, he kept one hand free, ready to grab hold of anything that might offer purchase. When a large piece of driftwood came hurtling toward him, he saw it coming and ducked beneath the water's surface for just a moment, letting it pass overhead before rising again, never losing his momentum. When he finally reached her side of the canyon, he pulled himself onto a narrow outcrop just below her ledge, water streaming from his clothes, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. He looked up at her, his face calm despite what he had just done, his eyes steady and dark as river stones. There was something ancient in that gaze, a depth that suggested he had seen more than his years should hold. And in that moment, Rose felt both exposed and strangely protected. He spoke in a low voice, barely audible above the roar, but the tone carried a certainty that cut through her fear. His words were measured, offering no false comfort, only the truth of what needed to happen. He told her to stay still, to trust him, to let him reach her before the ledge gave way. His voice held an accent she could not quite place, the vowels shaped differently than she was accustomed to. But the meaning was clear. Rose nodded, unable to form words. Her throat tight with terror and something else. A fragile thread of hope she had not felt moments before. Hemstian climbed with the precision of a man who had spent his life in the mountains, his hands finding holds in the stone that seemed invisible, his fingers pressing into cracks no wider than a knife blade. His body moved as if gravity held no claim over him, each movement economical and sure. Rose watched the muscles in his forearms flex as he pulled himself upward, the way his feet found purchase on surfaces that looked smooth as glass. When he reached her level, he did not speak again, only extended his hand, palm open, waiting. Rose stared at that hand, rough and scarred, the knuckles marked with old wounds that had healed into white lines. It was a hand that had worked, had fought, had survived. And something about its steadiness made her want to weep. She hesitated, her pride whispering that she should be able to save herself, that accepting help was an admission of failure. But the water surging at her feet drowned that voice. The ledge beneath her gave a sickening shift, a low grinding sound that warned of imminent collapse. She reached out, and their fingers locked, his grip firm and warm despite the cold rain. The contact sent a jolt through her, not of fear but of connection. As if in that touch she could feel his certainty flowing into her. He pulled her toward him, guiding her away from the crumbling ledge and onto the more stable outcrop where he stood. His movements were gentle but insistent, his other hand coming to rest on her elbow to steady her. The moment her boots found solid ground, the section of stone she had been standing on broke away with a crack like a rifle shot and tumbled into the flood below. Vanishing in an instant beneath the churning brown water, Rose gasped, her knees buckling as the reality of how close she had come crashed over her. But Hestian's arm wrapped around her waist, holding her upright with a strength that felt both protective and unobtrusive. She leaned into him without thinking, her body seeking the stability he offered. And for several heartbeats, they stood together in the storm. The water raging below, the rain hammering down around them. For the first time in days, Rose felt the warmth of another human being. And the sensation was so overwhelming that tears spilled down her cheeks. She looked up at him, searching his face for something she could not name, and found only a quiet resolve, a steadiness that made her believe, if only for a heartbeat, that she might survive this. His eyes met hers, and she saw no judgment there, no irritation at having to rescue a foolish woman who had gotten herself into trouble. There was only a calm acceptance, as if helping her was simply what one did when another person needed it. He spoke again, his voice low and even, telling her they needed to move, that the canyon was filling fast and they could not stay. The walls would funnel more water down as the storm continued upstream, and this outcrop would not remain dry for long. Rose nodded, still clinging to his arm, her legs unsteady beneath her. He guided her along the outcrop, moving with a careful patience, never rushing, never pulling too hard, always aware of where she placed her feet. When the path narrowed to barely a foot wide, he went first, testing each step before gesturing for her to follow, his hand reaching back to steady her when the stone grew slick. They climbed higher, away from the flood, following a narrow path that hugged the canyon wall. The ascent was steep and treacherous, the handholds few and far between. But Hestian navigated it with the ease of a man who had spent his entire life reading stone and understanding its secrets. He pointed out the safest routes, showed her where to place her hands, and when she slipped once, his reflexes were so quick that she barely had time to register the fall before his hand shot out and caught her wrist, holding her suspended for a breathless moment before pulling her back to safety. The rain began to ease as they climbed, the deluge softening into a steady drizzle, though the water below continued to churn with unrelenting fury. Rose's muscles burned with exhaustion, her hands were scraped raw from gripping stone, and her clothes hung heavy with water, but she pushed forward, driven by the quiet encouragement of the man ahead of her. Hastian led her to a shallow overhang where the stone curved inward, offering a small pocket of shelter from the downpour. The space was barely large enough for 2 people, but it was dry, and after the terror of the ledge, it felt like a palace. He gestured for her to sit, and she sank down onto the dry stone, her body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. Every muscle ached, her lungs burned from the climb, and her hands shook so badly she had to clasp them together to still them. Hastian crouched beside her, his eyes scanning the canyon below. Always watchful, always alert. Even in this moment of relative safety, he did not relax completely. His attention constantly shifting, reading the weather, the water level, the stability of the stone around them. Rose tried to speak, to thank him, but her voice came out as a hoarse whisper, the words catching in her throat. He glanced at her, and for the first time, she saw something soften in his expression, a flicker of understanding that knew words. He reached into a leather pouch at his side and produced a small piece of dried meat, offering it to her without ceremony. She took it, her hands shaking, and ate slowly, the salt and smoke grounding her back into her body, reminding her that she was alive, that she had survived. The meat was tough and required chewing, but it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. Each bite a small affirmation of continued existence. As she ate, she became aware of other sensations, the cold seeping into her bones now that the adrenaline was fading, the way her wet clothes clung to her skin, the exhaustion that made her limbs feel like lead. Hastian watched her for a moment, then reached into his pack and pulled out a woven blanket. Surprisingly dry despite everything, he draped it around her shoulders without asking, and Rose pulled it close, grateful for the warmth. They sat in silence as the storm continued its assault on the canyon, the flood below a constant roar that reminded them both how close she had come to disappearing into that brown, churning mass. Rose studied him from the corner of her eye, trying to understand who this man was, why he had risked his life for a stranger. His face was angular and weathered, shaped by sun and wind, his skin a deep bronze that spoke of years spent under open skies. There were lines around his eyes, not from age but from squinting into distances, from reading horizons and tracking movement across vast landscapes. His hair, now that she could see it more clearly, was long and straight, black as a raven's wing, still dripping water that ran in rivulets down his neck. He wore his clothes with a casual comfort that suggested they were made for function rather than fashion. The leather vest decorated with simple beadwork, the shirt beneath rough woven and sturdy. Around his neck hung a small pouch on a leather cord, and at his belt were a knife, the coiled rope, and other tools she could not identify. Everything about him spoke of practicality, of a life lived close to the earth. Guided by necessity rather than luxury, there was a stillness about him, a quality that made him seem both present and distant, as if part of him remained always attuned to the land around him. He did not fidget or shift unnecessarily, did not fill the silence with nervous chatter. Instead, he simply existed in the moment, comfortable with quiet in a way that Rose found both foreign and oddly comforting. In her world, silence was something to be filled, conversation a social obligation, but here, with this stranger who had saved her life, the quiet felt natural, even sacred. She wanted to ask his name, to know where he had come from, but exhaustion pulled at her like a weight. Her eyelids grew heavy, and despite the danger, despite the flood still raging below, she felt herself slipping toward sleep. The terror had drained something vital from her, leaving her hollow and spent. Hastian noticed, and without a word, he shifted closer, positioning himself between her and the edge of the overhang, offering the warmth of his presence without crowding her. Rose leaned slightly against the stone wall, her head tipping to the side, and in the moments before sleep claimed her, She felt his hand rest lightly on her shoulder, a gesture that carried no demand. Only the quiet assurance that she was no longer alone. It was the lightest touch. Barely more than a whisper of contact, but it anchored her. Gave her permission to let go of the vigilance that had kept her upright. Her breathing slowed, deepened, and she sank into sleep with the sound of the flood in her ears, and the unexpected comfort of a stranger's protection wrapped around her like the blanket on her shoulders. When she woke, the world had changed. The rain had stopped completely, and the air smelled clean and fresh. Washed free of dust, beyond the overhang, the canyon glowed with the pale gold light of late afternoon. The sun breaking through the clouds in long rays that illuminated the mist rising from the wet stone. The flood had receded slightly, though the canyon floor remained a muddy, debris-strewn ruin, littered with broken trees and boulders that had been carried down from higher elevations. Hastian sat a few feet away, his posture relaxed but alert, his gaze fixed on the trail ahead. He had not slept, she realized. Had kept watch the entire time she rested, ensuring that no new danger approached. The realization filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. Rose stirred, and he turned to her immediately, his expression unreadable but his attention complete. She sat up slowly, her body protesting with a chorus of aches and pains, and brushed damp hair from her face. Her fingers caught on tangles, and she gave up after a moment. Too tired to care about appearances, she finally found her voice, rusty from disuse and emotion, and thanked him. The words simple but weighted with everything she could not yet articulate. She told him she would have died without him, that she owed him her life, and even as she said it, the words felt inadequate, too small to carry the magnitude of what he had done. He nodded, a small dip of his head, and told her they would need to move soon. That the canyon was unstable and more rain could come. The storm might have passed over them, but upstream it could still be raging. Sending more water down through the narrow passage, they needed to reach higher ground. Find a place where they could see the weather coming and have room to move if necessary. Rose agreed, though her body ached and her legs felt unsteady. She knew he was right. As they prepared to leave the shelter, gathering what little they had, Rose asked the question that had been forming since she first saw him. She asked his name, her voice quiet but clear, and in asking, she felt as though she were crossing some invisible threshold, moving from rescued stranger to something else, something that had not yet been defined. He paused, considering her for a moment with those dark, steady eyes, then spoke it. The single word carrying a gravity that made it feel like a gift. Hastian, he said, and she repeated it, testing the shape of it on her tongue. Feeling the way it settled in her mouth, the name felt right somehow. Solid and strong, like the man himself. He asked hers in return, and when she gave it, Rose Campbell, something flickered in his eyes. A recognition not of her name, but of the person behind it. An acknowledgement that she was no longer just a woman in distress, but someone with an identity. A history, a story of her own. They began to move, leaving the shelter of the overhang and following the high trail that wound along the canyon rim, away from the flood's reach. The path was narrow and treacherous, hugging the cliff face, with the long drop on one side and the stone wall on the other. But Hastian moved with a confidence that made each step seem deliberate. And Rose followed, placing her feet where he placed his, trusting his knowledge of this unforgiving land. As they walked, she noticed the way he read the terrain with an intimacy that spoke of deep understanding. The small adjustments he made to avoid loose stones, the way his eyes tracked the sky for signs of returning weather, the manner in which he tested each handhold before committing his weight. He was a man shaped by this wilderness, carved by it the way water carves stone. Patiently and over time, and in his presence. Despite everything that had happened, Rose began to feel the first stirrings of safety. A sense that as long as she stayed close to him, she might survive whatever else this land threw at her. But as the sun dipped lower and shadows stretched long across the canyon, she also felt the weight of what had happened pressing down on her with renewed force. She had nearly died. Would have died if not for this stranger who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to speak. The realization left her shaken, not just by the danger itself, but by the sudden, undeniable truth that she could not navigate this world alone. That her father's lessons, while valuable, had not prepared her for every situation. That sometimes survival meant accepting help, meant trusting another person with your life. The thought unsettled her, challenged beliefs she had built her identity around, and as they continued along the trail, the floodwaters still roaring faintly in the distance below them, Rose wondered who Hastian truly was, where he had come from, and what twist of fate had brought him to that canyon at the exact moment she needed him most. She wondered if he had been tracking something, if he lived nearby, if he often traveled these trails. But more than that, she wondered what would happen next, where this path would lead them, and whether the connection she felt forming between them was real, or simply the result of shared trauma and desperate circumstance. The questions multiplied as they walked, but she kept them to herself, saving them for later, when they had reached true safety and could afford the luxury of conversation. For now, it was enough to follow his steady lead, to trust in his knowledge, and to be grateful that she was still alive to wonder anything at all. The trail climbed steadily away from the canyon's throat, winding through a landscape transformed by water into something both beautiful and hostile. The setting sun painted the wet rocks in shades of copper and gold, and everywhere Rose looked, she saw evidence of the flood's fury. Uprooted sagebrush tangled in crevices, fresh scars where boulders had tumbled down slopes, and rivulets still trickling across the path like veins of liquid silver. Hastian moved ahead of her with that same unhurried grace, pausing occasionally to test the ground or scan the darkening horizon. And each time he stopped, Rose found herself studying the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself with a readiness that never seemed to tire. They had been walking for nearly an hour when the path opened onto a flat mesa that stretched wide and exposed beneath the dimming sky. The air here felt different, cleaner somehow, as if the elevation had lifted them above the storm's lingering heaviness. Hastian led her toward a cluster of juniper trees that grew twisted and ancient near the mesa's edge, their gnarled trunks offering shelter and their branches still mostly dry despite the rain. He gestured for her to sit, and Rose lowered herself onto a flat stone. Grateful to rest her trembling legs, the silence between them had grown comfortable during the climb. But now, with the immediate danger behind them and the night approaching, Rose felt the weight of unspoken questions pressing against her ribs. She watched as Hastian gathered dry wood from beneath the junipers, selecting pieces with care, testing their weight and dryness before adding them to a small pile. His movements were efficient and practiced, the actions of someone who had built countless fires in countless places. And within minutes he had coaxed a flame to life using a striker and a bit of char cloth he produced from his pouch. The fire grew quickly, fed by the dry wood, and its warmth reached across the space between them like an invisible hand. Rose extended her fingers toward the heat, feeling sensation return to her cold, numbed skin. And for the first time since the flood had trapped her on that ledge, she allowed herself to believe she might actually survive the night. Hastian sat across from her, the flames casting shadows that danced across his features, softening the hard lines and making him seem almost otherworldly. She wanted to ask him everything at once. Where he had come from, why he had been in that canyon, whether he made a habit of rescuing foolish travelers who ventured into dangerous territory without proper preparation. But the words tangled in her throat, held back by a shyness that surprised her. Rose had never been shy, had always spoken her mind with a directness her mother called unladylike. Yet something about this man made her cautious, made her want to choose her words with care. Hastian solved the problem by speaking first, his voice low and measured, asking if she was injured. The question was practical, devoid of judgment, and Rose appreciated the straightforwardness of it. She told him no, nothing serious, just scrapes and bruises that would heal. Though her pride had taken a beating, she might not recover from so easily.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
She tried to make the last part sound light, almost joking. But her voice cracked on the words and betrayed the fear that still pulsed beneath her skin. He nodded slowly, feeding another piece of wood to the fire, and told her that pride was a luxury the wilderness could not afford. The statement was simple, almost casual, but it carried a weight that made Rose look up sharply. She saw no accusation in his eyes, only a calm certainty, the kind that comes from hard-earned experience rather than empty philosophy. He told her he had seen many people die in these mountains, some from bad luck, some from inexperience, but most from the belief that they could face nature alone and emerge victorious. The words stung because they were true, and Rose felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she had not been reckless, that her father had taught her well, but even as the excuses formed in her mind, she recognized them as hollow. She had been reckless, had ignored the warnings about spring storms, had pushed forward when every sign told her to seek shelter. And if not for Hastian's intervention, that recklessness would have cost her everything. She swallowed hard and admitted as much, her voice barely above a whisper. She told him he was right, that she had been foolish, that she had let her need to prove something override her common sense. The confession felt like pulling splinters from beneath her skin, painful but necessary, and once she started, the words kept coming. She told him about her father's death, about the weight of being the only child, about her mother's expectations and her own desperate need to show that she could navigate the world without protection. She told him about the ranch they were trying to save, the debts that had piled up after her father's accident, and her plan to reach her uncle in Colorado, who had promised work and perhaps a fresh start. She explained how she had left Santa Fe with barely enough supplies, how she had stretched her meager funds by traveling alone rather than paying for passage with a wagon train, how every decision had been calculated to prove she did not need anyone's help. And look where that had gotten her, trapped on a ledge, screaming into a storm, waiting to die. Hastian listened without interrupting, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. And when she finally fell silent, exhausted by her own honesty, he remained quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling upward into the gathering darkness, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote's howl rose and fell like a question without an answer. Finally he spoke, telling her that strength was not measured by what you could do alone, but by knowing when to accept the help that was offered. He told her about his own people, about the way they moved through the seasons together, sharing burdens and celebrations, understanding that survival was a communal act rather than an individual triumph. He spoke of his grandfather, a man who had lived through the long years of conflict and displacement, who had taught Hastian that true courage meant acknowledging vulnerability, not denying it. His voice carried no sermon, no judgment, only the quiet sharing of hard-won wisdom. Rose felt something shift inside her chest, a softening of the rigid pride that had governed so many of her choices. She realized that in trying to prove her independence, she had actually been demonstrating the opposite. She had been so afraid of appearing weak that she had made herself brittle, inflexible, unable to bend when bending was what survival required. The realization was humbling, but also strangely liberating, as if acknowledging the truth allowed her to finally set down a weight she had been carrying for too long. As the night deepened around them, Hastian prepared a simple meal from the supplies in his pack. dried venison, cornmeal cakes wrapped in cloth, and a handful of wild onions he had somehow spotted and gathered during their climb. He worked with quiet efficiency, using a flat stone near the fire to warm the food. And when he offered her a portion, Rose accepted with genuine gratitude. The food was plain but delicious, each bite grounding her further back into her body, reminding her of the simple gift of being alive. They ate in comfortable silence, and Rose found herself relaxing in a way she had not relaxed in months. There was something about Hestian's presence that felt solid, dependable, like a stone foundation that would not shift beneath her feet. He did not fill the quiet with unnecessary chatter, did not seem uncomfortable with pauses in conversation, and Rose appreciated the space to simply exist without performance or pretense. When the meal was finished, Hestian banked the fire and told her she should sleep, that tomorrow would bring another long day of travel. He explained that the flood had likely destroyed sections of the main trail, and they would need to find alternate routes through terrain that would be challenging even in good conditions. Rose nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she truly was. Every muscle in her body aching with the kind of deep fatigue that comes from surviving something that should have killed you. She lay down near the fire, using her satchel as a pillow and wrapping herself in the blanket Hestian had given her. The ground was hard beneath her back, and the night air carried a chill that made her shiver despite the flames. But she felt safer than she had felt in days. She watched as Hestian settled himself on the opposite side of the fire, his back against a juniper trunk, his rifle resting across his knees. He would keep watch, she realized, would stay awake to ensure nothing approached while she slept. The knowledge should have made her feel guilty, should have prompted her to insist on taking the turn at watch, but exhaustion pulled at her like a tide, and she found herself drifting towards sleep before she could form the words. Her last conscious thought was a wordless gratitude, a feeling that expanded in her chest like warmth spreading through cold water. And then sleep claimed her, deep and dreamless. The kind of sleep that comes only when the body knows it is truly safe. She woke once in the deepest part of the night, startled by a sound she could not identify. Her eyes opened to darkness pierced only by the fire's dim glow, and for a moment, panic seized her as she struggled to remember where she was. But then she saw Hestian, still sitting in the same position, still watchful, and the panic receded. He must have sensed her waking because he turned his head slightly. Meeting her gaze across the fire, he did not speak, only nodded once. A gesture of reassurance, and Rose closed her eyes again, sinking back into sleep with the image of his steady presence burned into her mind. Morning arrived slowly, creeping across the mesa in shades of gray and pink. The sky washed clean by yesterday's storm. Rose woke to the smell of smoke and something cooking, and she sat up to find Hestian crouched by the fire, turning strips of meat on a flat stone. He glanced at her and offered what might have been a smile, though it was so slight she could not be certain. "Good morning," he said simply, and Rose returned the greeting, her voice still rough with sleep. She rose stiffly, her body protesting every movement, and walked to the edge of the mesa to relieve herself behind a screen of juniper. When she returned, breakfast was ready, and they ate quickly, efficiently, both of them understanding without discussion that they needed to make the most of the daylight. The meat was rabbit, Hestian told her, caught in a snare he had set before dawn. And Rose marveled at his resourcefulness, at the way he seemed to coax sustenance from a landscape that had nearly killed her. After breakfast, they packed up the camp with practiced speed, Hestian burying the fire's remains and scattering the ashes. Leaving no trace of their presence, Rose asked why he was so careful to hide their camp, and he explained that in this territory it was wise to assume someone was always watching. The words sent a chill down her spine, and she remembered suddenly that she knew nothing about this land she was traveling through, nothing about the dangers that might exist beyond floods and storms. As they prepared to descend from the mesa, Hastian paused and looked at her with an expression that seemed to carry a question. He asked where she had been heading, what her destination was, and Rose told him about Colorado, about her uncle's ranch near Durango, where she hoped to find work and a new start. Hastian listened, then told her that the main trail was likely impassable for days, possibly weeks, but there was another route, older and less traveled, that would take her north through Apache territory. The word Apache made Rose's breath catch, and Hastian must have seen the fear flicker across her face because he added, almost gently, that his people were not the monsters the newspapers made them out to be. He told her that most Apache wanted only to be left alone, to live on their ancestral lands without interference, but that the government's broken promises and constant encroachment had created a tension that sometimes erupted into violence. He said if she traveled with him, if she respected the land and the people they might encounter, she would be safer than she had been on the main trail alone. Rose considered his words, weighing the fear that had been taught to her against the evidence of the man standing before her. Hastian had saved her life, had shown her nothing but kindness and respect, had shared his food and his wisdom without asking for anything in return. If he was representative of his people, then perhaps everything she had been told was wrong, or at least incomplete. She made her decision in that moment, trusting not what she had been taught, but what she had experienced, and told him she would be grateful for his guidance. Something in his posture relaxed slightly, a tension she had not noticed releasing, and he nodded once before turning to lead the way down from the mesa. The descent was steep and required concentration. The rocks still slick from yesterday's rain, and Rose focused on her footing, trying not to think about how far she would fall if she slipped. Hastian moved with his usual confidence, occasionally pointing out secure handholds or warning her about loose stones. And slowly they made their way down to a narrow valley that ran like a scar between red rock walls. The valley floor was still wet, the ground soft beneath their boots, and Rose noticed tracks pressed into the mud: deer, coyote, and something larger that she could not identify. Hastian crouched to examine the larger tracks, his fingers tracing the outline with a gentleness that surprised her. And when he stood, his expression had grown more serious. He told her the tracks were fresh, made sometime during the night, and belonged to a mountain lion that had passed through heading east. They walked more carefully after that, Hastian's attention constantly shifting, reading the landscape with an intensity that made Rose aware of just how much she did not know about surviving in this country. She realized that every sound, every shadow, every change in the wind carried information that she could not interpret, but that Hastian understood instinctively. She began to pay closer attention, trying to learn by observation, noticing the way he avoided walking in open areas where they would be silhouetted against the sky, the way he chose paths that offered cover and escape routes, the way his hand never strayed far from the knife at his belt. Around midday, they stopped to rest beside a narrow stream that tumbled down from the heights, the water clear and cold, gift from the storm that had nearly killed her. Rose knelt and drank deeply, the water so cold it made her teeth ache, and when she looked up, she found Hastian watching her with an expression she could not read. There was something in his gaze that made her heart quicken, a warmth that seemed to extend beyond simple concern for her welfare. She wanted to ask what he was thinking, but before she could form the question, he turned away, his attention caught by something downstream. He stood slowly, his body going very still, and Rose felt her own muscles tense in response. She followed his gaze and saw nothing at first, just rocks and water and the shadows of clouds moving across the canyon walls. But then she saw it, a thin column of smoke rising in the distance. Too straight and steady to be natural, Hastian's jaw tightened, and he motioned for her to move back into the cover of the rocks. She obeyed without question, her heart beginning to pound as she realized they were no longer alone in this wilderness. He crouched beside her, his voice barely above a whisper as he explained that the smoke meant riders. Probably a small group, and given the location, they were likely not friendly. Rose asked if they were Apache, and Hastian shook his head, telling her his people rarely made such obvious camps unless they wanted to be found. More likely, he said, it was a group of prospectors or hide hunters, men who had come into this territory looking for wealth and who had little regard for whose land they were crossing. Such men could be dangerous, especially to a woman traveling with an Apache scout, their prejudices and greed making them quick to violence. He told her they would need to circle wide around the camp, adding hours to their journey but ensuring they remained unseen. Rose nodded, trusting his judgment completely, and they began to move, staying low and quiet, picking their way through the rocks with painstaking care. The detour took them up a steep slope covered in loose scree that shifted beneath their feet, threatening to send them sliding backward with every step. Rose's legs burned with the effort, and more than once she had to stop to catch her breath. But Hastian remained patient, never rushing her, always ready to offer a hand when the climb grew too difficult. By the time they reached the top of the slope and could see down into the next valley, the sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon. From their elevated position, Rose could see the camp Hastian had spotted. 3 men gathered around a fire, their horses picketed nearby, and even from this distance, she could see the casual arrogance in their postures, the way they moved through the land as if they owned it. Hastian studied the camp for a long moment, his expression unreadable. And then he turned to her and said they would need to find shelter for the night soon. Somewhere defensible where they could see anyone approaching. The implication was clear. Those men below represented a threat that would not disappear simply because they had avoided the camp. And as they moved away from the ridge, heading deeper into the backcountry, Rose realized that the flood had been only the first danger she would face on this journey. There were other threats in this wilderness, human ones, and she understood with sudden clarity that without Hastian, she would have no chance of surviving them. The realization should have frightened her, but instead, it brought a strange sense of peace. She had spent so long trying to prove she needed no one, and in doing so, she had made herself vulnerable. Now, walking behind this quiet Apache scout who had appeared in her moment of greatest need, Rose began to understand that true strength lay not in isolation, but in knowing who to trust. And against all logic, against everything she had been taught about his people, she trusted Hastian with a certainty that felt like faith. As darkness gathered around them once more, they found shelter in a shallow cave that offered protection and concealment. And Rose settled in for another night in the wilderness. Another night of watching Hastian keep vigil while she slept. But before exhaustion claimed her, she made a silent promise to herself that she would learn from him, would become the kind of person who could survive in this hard country, not through stubborn independence, but through wisdom, awareness, and the courage to accept help when it was offered. The fire crackled softly between them, and outside the cave, the night creatures began their ancient songs. And Rose closed her eyes knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, but also perhaps new understanding. And for the first time since her father's death, she felt something that resembled hope. Dawn broke with a violence of color that seemed impossible after the gray storm, the sky bleeding crimson and orange across the eastern horizon as if the world itself were being reborn. Rose woke to find Hastian already moving, dismantling their small camp with the same careful efficiency he brought to everything, erasing signs of their presence as thoroughly as wind erases tracks from sand. She sat up quickly, embarrassed that she had slept so deeply while he maintained his vigil, and he glanced at her with something that might have been amusement flickering in his dark eyes. He handed her a piece of dried fruit and some water from his canteen. Breakfast consumed standing because they needed to move before full light exposed them on the hillside. Rose chewed mechanically, her body still sluggish with sleep. but her mind already racing ahead to the day's challenges. Hastian told her they would follow the high ridges today, staying above the canyon floors where the three riders might be searching for easier passage. The terrain would be brutal, exposed rock and steep grades that would test her endurance, but it would keep them invisible to anyone traveling the lower routes. They set out as the sun cleared the mountains, climbing steadily into country that grew more austere with each step. The vegetation thinned to scattered pinyon pines and tough bunchgrass that clung to crevices in the stone. And the air turned sharp and thin, making Rose's lungs work harder with every breath. Hastian moved ahead of her with his tireless stride, occasionally pausing to check their back trail or scan the valleys below. His vigilance constant and thorough by mid-morning. They had gained enough elevation that Rose could see for miles in every direction, the land spreading out in waves of red and tan, cut through with dark gashes where canyons carved deep into the earth. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache, vast and indifferent. A landscape that had existed long before humans walked it and would continue long after they were gone. She understood now why Hastian spoke of the land with such reverence, why his people fought so hard to remain connected to it. This was not empty wilderness waiting to be tamed, but a living entity with its own rhythms and rules. They stopped briefly near a rockfall where water had collected in a natural basin, and while they drank, Hastian pointed out landmarks in the distance, naming them in his own language and then translating. He showed her the dark smudge on the horizon that marked the beginning of pine forests to the north, told her that beyond those trees lay the high country where his grandmother's people had once summered, gathering acorns and hunting elk before the soldiers came. His voice carried no bitterness when he spoke of these things, only a matter-of-fact acknowledgement of history. But Rose heard the loss beneath his words. She asked him where his family was now, the question emerging before she could consider whether it was too personal. But Hastian did not seem offended. He told her his mother had died when he was young, fever taking her in a single night despite the medicine woman's efforts. His father had fallen in a skirmish with Mexican soldiers 5 years ago, defending a camp that was attacked without warning. He had a sister married to a man from another band, living somewhere near the Gila River, and a brother who had chosen to stay on the reservation the government had designated, believing that cooperation offered better odds of survival than resistance. Hastian himself moved between worlds, he explained, working sometimes as a scout for the army when it suited him, trading with Mexican settlements when he needed supplies, but spending most of his time alone in the backcountry, traveling the old routes and maintaining a connection to the land that reservation life made impossible. It was a precarious existence, always balanced on the edge of acceptance and suspicion, but it was the only way he knew to remain true to what his grandfather had taught him. Rose listened with growing understanding, recognizing in his story echoes of her own displacement. They were both orphans of a kind, both caught between what had been and what might be, both trying to navigate a world that kept shifting beneath their feet. The recognition created a bond between them that went deeper than gratitude or circumstance, a shared understanding of what it meant to be unmoored. As they continued climbing, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Rose told him about growing up on her family's small ranch outside Santa Fe, about learning to ride before she could properly walk, about her father's patient teaching and her mother's quiet strength. She described the way summer thunderstorms would roll across the grasslands, bringing the smell of rain and ozone, and how she used to sit on the porch watching lightning dance between clouds. Hastian listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he was truly paying attention. And Rose found herself sharing memories she had not spoken aloud since her father's death. The trail grew more treacherous as they climbed higher, forcing them to navigate narrow ledges where a misstep would mean a fatal fall. Rose's fear of heights, which she had managed to suppress during yesterday's desperate scramble, returned with full force, making her hands shake and her vision narrow. Hastian noticed immediately, moving back to position himself between her and the drop. His presence solid and reassuring. He told her to focus on the rock face, to think only about the next handhold. The next step, nothing beyond that. His calm instruction helped. And Rose forced herself to breathe deeply, to trust her body and the stone beneath her fingers. Inch by inch, they traversed the exposed section. And when they finally reached wider ground, Rose's legs nearly buckled with relief. Hastian steadied her with a hand on her elbow. His touch brief but grounding, and she saw approval in his eyes. Recognition that she had pushed through her fear rather than surrendering to it. They reached the ridgeline by early afternoon. A knife edge of rock that offered commanding views, but no shelter from the wind that howled across the heights. Hastian led her down the far side into a protected hollow where stunted junipers grew twisted by decades of wind, and they rested in the lee of the trees. Grateful for the reprieve from the constant buffeting, Rose's face felt raw from windburn, and her lips had cracked despite her attempts to keep them moist. But she said nothing, unwilling to complain when Hastian showed no sign of discomfort. He produced more food from his seemingly bottomless pack. This time cornmeal mixed with berries that had been pounded into a dense cake. And they ate slowly, conserving their energy. Rose asked how much farther they had to travel. And Hastian told her that if they maintained their current pace, they would reach the edge of the high pine forests by tomorrow evening. From there, the terrain would ease, and she could follow established trails toward the Colorado settlements. The information should have brought relief, but instead, Rose felt an unexpected pang at the thought of their journey ending. She had grown accustomed to Hastian's presence, to his quiet competence and steady reliability, and the prospect of continuing alone suddenly seemed daunting. She pushed the feeling aside, telling herself it was simply fear of the unknown. But part of her recognized it as something more complicated, as they prepared to move again. A sound drifted up from the valley below, faint but distinct. The crack of a rifle shot followed by distant shouting. Hastian's entire body went rigid, his head cocked to catch any additional sounds. And Rose held her breath, her heart suddenly pounding. Another shot echoed across the distance, then silence. Hastian moved to the edge of their hollow and peered carefully down into the valley. His jaw tight, he returned quickly and told her they needed to move now. That the shots had come from the direction of the riders they had seen yesterday. And while he could not be certain what was happening, gunfire in these remote areas rarely meant anything good. They gathered their things with urgent efficiency and set off along the ridge. Moving faster now despite the difficult terrain, Rose's earlier fatigue vanished, replaced by adrenaline that sharpened her senses and quickened her steps. They traveled for 2 hours without stopping, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and whatever violence had erupted below. The sun had begun its descent when Hastian finally slowed their pace, satisfied that they had created sufficient buffer. But the tension in his shoulders remained, and Rose understood that they were no longer simply traveling through wilderness, but actively fleeing potential danger. As evening approached, they descended from the exposed ridges into a narrow canyon where cottonwood trees grew thick along a permanent stream. The canyon offered both water and concealment, and Hastian declared they would camp here for the night. But unlike previous camps, he did not build a fire, telling Rose that smoke could be seen for miles in the clear evening air, and they could not risk drawing attention. They ate cold food in the gathering darkness, and Rose wrapped herself in her blanket against the chill, missing the fire's warmth but understanding the necessity of caution. Hastian sat nearby, his rifle across his knees, and the familiar sight of him keeping watch had become oddly comforting. She asked him what he thought had happened in the valley, whether the shots meant someone was hurt or dead. And he considered the question before answering. He told her that in his experience, Gunfire in the wilderness usually meant conflict over resources, water rights, mining claims, or simply the kind of casual violence that erupted when desperate men encountered each other in lawless territory. It was also possible, he added more quietly, that someone had encountered Apache hunters and responded with the shoot-first mentality that many settlers brought to this country. His people had learned to be ghosts in their own land, moving unseen and leaving no trace, but sometimes they were discovered anyway. And when they were, the results were often bloody. Rose felt shame curl in her stomach as she recognized her own earlier prejudices reflected in his words. She had carried those same fears, had believed the stories about savage Apache raiders. And yet the only violence she had witnessed or heard since entering this territory had come from white men. Hastian had shown her nothing but kindness and protection, had saved her life and asked nothing in return. And she wondered how many others like him existed.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
People whose humanity was denied by the very settlers who claimed to be bringing civilization to the wilderness. She tried to apologize for her earlier assumptions, stumbling over the words, but Hastian stopped her with a gentle gesture. He told her that acknowledging ignorance was the first step toward wisdom, that his grandfather had taught him not to judge people by their initial reactions, but by their willingness to learn and change. His words carried no condescension, only the patient understanding of someone who had encountered prejudice so often it no longer surprised him. They sat in companionable silence as full darkness settled over the canyon, the stars emerging in brilliant profusion overhead. Rose had never seen so many stars, the city lights of Santa Fe obscuring most of them. And she found herself mesmerized by the vast sweep of the Milky Way. Hastian pointed out constellations, sharing stories his grandfather had told him about the patterns and their meanings. Tales of hunters and animals and great journeys across the sky. His voice in the darkness was soothing. And Rose felt herself relaxing despite the day's tensions. She asked him to tell her more, hungry for these stories that connected the visible world to deeper meanings. And he obliged, speaking of the way his people read the land, how every plant and animal carried messages for those who knew how to listen. He told her about the coming of monsoon season, about the tracks that frost leaves on morning grass, about the different calls of ravens and what each one meant. Rose absorbed it all, recognizing that she was receiving an education more valuable than anything she had learned in the schoolhouse. This was knowledge earned through generations of close observation, refined by the need for survival, and freely shared with someone who had every reason to hoard it. She felt grateful beyond words, not just for the information itself, but for the trust implicit in the sharing. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and she lay down on the soft canyon earth, the sound of the nearby stream a gentle lullaby. Before sleep took her, she called softly to Hastian, asking if he ever slept, and she heard the smile in his voice when he answered that he would rest later, that watching over her was no burden. The words warmed her more than any fire could have, and she drifted off with a sense of safety that had nothing to do with weapons or walls. She woke once in the deep night to find the stars had wheeled overhead, marking the passage of hours, and she saw Hastian's silhouette against the sky. Still watchful, still present, she wanted to insist that he rest, that she could keep watch for a while, but her body felt too heavy to move, and the words would not form. Instead, she simply watched him for a moment, this unexpected guardian who had entered her life with the force off the flood itself, and wondered what debt she owed that could never truly be repaid. Morning came too soon, announced by the raucous calling of ravens in the cottonwoods. Rose woke stiff and sore, every muscle protesting the previous day's exertions. But she forced herself upright, determined not to slow their progress. Hastian already had their gear packed, and he handed her food and water with his usual quiet efficiency. His eyes showed no sign of sleeplessness, and Rose marveled at his endurance, wondering if it was training or simply necessity that had taught him to function on so little rest. They followed the canyon downstream for several miles, the walking easier here where the land was level and the stream provided a reliable guide. Birds flitted through the cottonwoods, and once they startled a small herd of mule deer that bounded away with white tails flashing. The morning held a peaceful quality that made the previous day's tensions seem almost imaginary, but Hestian remained alert, his attention constantly scanning their surroundings. Around midday, they reached a point where the canyon opened into a broad valley, and Hestian climbed a small rise to survey the terrain ahead. He stood there for a long time, so still he might have been carved from the same stone that surrounded them. And when he finally descended, his expression had grown troubled. He told Rose that he had seen smoke again, multiple columns this time, and they were coming from the direction they needed to travel. The implications were clear. Whatever conflict had begun yesterday was continuing or perhaps escalating, and their route north led directly through the affected area. Hestian laid out their options. They could attempt a wide detour to the east that would add days to their journey and take them through even more remote country. Or they could proceed with extreme caution and hope to slip through unnoticed. Both choices carried risks, and he left the decision to Rose. She considered carefully, weighing her fear against the practical need to reach her uncle's ranch before her meager funds ran completely dry. Finally, she told him she trusted his judgment, that he knew this country far better than she ever would, and whatever choice he made, she would follow. Hestian studied her for a moment, then nodded, and she saw something in his eyes that might have been respect. He chose the cautious advance, explaining that the eastern detour would take them into territory where water was scarce and the terrain unforgiving, and he was not confident they had sufficient supplies for such an extended journey. They would move carefully, staying to high ground where they could see danger approaching. And if they encountered anyone, they would decide in the moment how to respond. They spent the rest of the afternoon climbing out of the valley, ascending through a series of switchbacks that tested Rose's endurance to its limits. By the time they reached the top, her legs trembled with fatigue and her breath came in ragged gasps. But the view that greeted them made the effort worthwhile. Spread out below was a vast plateau dotted with pinyon and juniper, and in the distance, Rose could see the dark line of pine forests that marked the beginning of the high country Hestian had promised. But she also saw the smoke he had mentioned. 3 distinct columns rising from different points on the plateau, too far away to determine their source, but close enough to represent a clear threat. Hestian pointed out a route that would take them along the plateau's northern edge, skirting the smoke and keeping them at the margins where they could disappear into the rough country if necessary. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, painting the plateau in shades of amber and gold, they made their way carefully toward whatever awaited them. 2 travelers bound together by circumstance and growing understanding, moving through a landscape that offered both beauty and danger in equal measure. And Rose found herself hoping that when they finally reached safety and their paths diverged, she would carry more than memories of the journey. She would carry the lessons Hestian had taught her about strength and humility, about reading the land and trusting carefully chosen companions, about surviving not through stubborn isolation, but through the wisdom of knowing when to accept the help that was offered. The plateau stretched before them in the fading light, full of unknown challenges and potential threats. But for the first time since the flood had trapped her on that ledge, Rose felt equal to whatever might come, not because she had suddenly become capable of facing it alone, but because she had finally learned that true courage meant walking forward with open eyes and an open heart, ready to trust in the goodness that sometimes appeared when you needed it most. The plateau stretched endlessly before them, a sea of sage and stone that seemed to hold its breath as twilight descended. Hastian led them along a deer trail that wound between low ridges, keeping to the shadows where the fading light would not silhouette them against the sky. Rose followed with growing unease, her eyes drawn repeatedly to those columns of smoke that rose like dark fingers against the bruised horizon. Each one represented human presence, possibly conflict, and their path would take them dangerously close to at least two of the sites. They moved in silence now, Hastian having made it clear with a gesture that voices carried far in the evening air. Rose focused on placing her feet exactly where he placed his, avoiding loose stones that might clatter and dry branches that might snap. She had learned much about moving quietly over the past days, but now she put that knowledge to use with desperate concentration, understanding that discovery could mean death. As darkness gathered, they descended into a shallow wash where twisted junipers provided cover. Hastian finally stopped, kneeling in the sand to examine tracks that Rose could barely see in the dim light. He ran his fingers along the impressions, reading them like text, and when he looked up at her, his expression was grave. He whispered that a group of riders had passed through within the last few hours, moving fast and heading toward the nearest smoke column. The track showed at least 6 horses, possibly more, and from the depth of the prints, the riders were heavily laden with gear. Rose felt her stomach tighten as she absorbed this information. 6 men or more, armed and purposeful, somewhere ahead of them in the darkness. Hastian must have seen the fear in her face because he moved closer, his hand finding her shoulder in a gesture of reassurance. He told her they would wait here until full dark, then circle wide around the area where the riders had been heading. It would cost them time and energy, but safety demanded caution. They settled into the wash to wait, and Rose became acutely aware of every sound. The rustle of wind through sage, the distant yip of coyotes, the soft hoot of an owl hunting somewhere overhead. Hastian sat perfectly still beside her, his breathing so controlled she could barely hear it, and she tried to match his calm, to slow her racing heart and find stillness within herself. The wait felt eternal, though it could not have been more than an hour before Hastian judged the darkness sufficient for movement. They climbed out of the wash and began their detour, moving now with painstaking slowness across terrain that offered little cover. The moon had not yet risen, and the starlight alone provided barely enough illumination to avoid obstacles. Rose stumbled more than once, catching herself with outstretched hands, and each time Hastian paused to ensure she had regained her footing. They had traveled perhaps 2 miles when Hastian suddenly dropped to the ground. Pulling Rose down with him, she landed hard. The breath knocked from her lungs, but before she could protest, she heard what had alarmed him. Voices carried on the night breeze, men speaking in the casual tones of those who believed themselves alone. Hastian pressed a finger to his lips, then gestured for her to crawl forward, to where a cluster of boulders would provide both concealment and a vantage point. They reached the rocks and carefully raised their heads to peer over. Below them, perhaps 100 yards away, a camp had been established in a natural amphitheater formed by low cliffs. A large fire burned in the center, its light illuminating a scene that made Rose's blood run cold. 8 or 9 men lounged around the flames, their faces hard and weathered, guns prominently displayed. But it was what lay beyond the fire that captured her horrified attention. 3 Apache men sat bound against the cliff face, their hands tied behind them, their faces swollen and bloodied, even from this distance. Rose could see they had been badly beaten, and one slumped forward in a way that suggested unconsciousness or worse. The white men were laughing, passing a bottle between them, and their conversation, now more clearly audible, revealed they were discussing what to do with their prisoners come morning. Hastian had gone completely rigid beside her, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. She watched his hand move slowly to the knife at his belt, saw the war between reason and rage playing across his features. She touched his arm gently, a wordless plea for caution, and felt the tremor that ran through him for a long moment. She thought he might ignore her and charge down into the camp alone. But finally he exhaled slowly and eased back from the rocks. They retreated carefully to a safe distance before Hastian allowed himself to speak. And when he did, his voice shook with barely controlled fury. He told her those were men from his sister's band, men he knew, and that the beating they had received was likely just the beginning. The white men in that camp were hide hunters, he explained. Men who killed buffalo for their skins and left the meat to rot. Men who saw Apache as vermin to be exterminated. They would torture those prisoners come morning, make sport of their suffering, then kill them and claim bounties from the army for hostile scalps. Rose felt sick. Her earlier understanding of frontier violence becoming viscerally real. She asked what they could do, her voice barely a whisper. And Hastian looked at her with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of pain. He said they could do nothing, that 2 people against 9 armed men was suicide. That he had no right to ask her to risk her life for his people. But even as he spoke the words, she saw the anguish behind them. The impossible choice between self-preservation and honor. Rose surprised herself with what came next. She told him she would help. That she could not walk away knowing what would happen to those men. That some things were worth the risk. Hastian stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. And she saw disbelief war with hope in his expression. He asked why. Why would she endanger herself for Apache men she did not know? And Rose found she had no rational answer. She only knew that standing by while others suffered was a betrayal of everything her father had taught her about right and wrong. Hastian was silent for a long time, studying her face in the starlight, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made her shiver. He told her that if they did this, if they attempted a rescue, there would be no going back. Those men would hunt them, would pursue them with a vengeance that would not end until someone was dead. Rose nodded, understanding but resolved, and saw something shift in Hastian's eyes. A decision being made, he laid out a plan with swift efficiency. Speaking in urgent whispers, the camp below had grown loud with drink. The men's attention focused inward on their fire and their bottle. Hastian would circle around to approach from behind the cliff where the prisoners were bound, while Rose would create a distraction from their current position. He gave her his rifle, showing her quickly how to load and fire it, and told her to wait for his signal, then shoot high over the camp. The plan was terrifyingly simple. Rose's shots would draw the men's attention and possibly send them scrambling for cover, giving Hastian precious seconds to cut the prisoners free and lead them into the darkness. If all went well, they would reunite at a landmark Hastian described, a distinctive rock formation 2 miles north. If things went badly, Rose was to run and not look back, to head for the pine forests and seek help from the first settlement she found. Rose wanted to argue, to insist on a plan that kept them together. But she saw the logic in his strategy and knew they had no time for debate. Hastian gripped her shoulder once, his touch conveying both gratitude and farewell, then disappeared into the darkness with the fluid grace of a shadow. Rose was alone, crouched behind the rocks with a rifle in her trembling hands and fear coursing through her veins like ice water. She forced herself to breathe slowly, counting the seconds as Hastian had instructed, giving him time to circle around. Below, the men had grown louder, their laughter carrying an ugly edge. One of them stood and walked toward the prisoners, and Rose saw him kick the unconscious Apache man with casual cruelty. Her finger tightened on the rifle's trigger, rage momentarily overwhelming fear. Then she saw it. A brief flash of movement behind the cliff, barely visible but unmistakable. Hastian had reached the prisoners. Rose raised the rifle, her hands steadier now that action was upon her, and sighted on a point well above the camp. She squeezed the trigger, and the rifle bucked against her shoulder with shocking force, the report echoing across the plateau like thunder. The effect on the camp was instantaneous. Men dove for their weapons, shouting in confusion and alarm. Some scrambling for cover while others stood frozen. Trying to locate the source of the shot, Rose fired again, then a third time, spacing the shots to suggest multiple attackers, and saw the camp dissolve into chaos. Men were yelling contradictory orders, some pointing in her direction while others scanned different horizons. She kept firing, loading with fumbling fingers and shooting high, maintaining the distraction as long as she dared. Then, as Hastian had instructed, she turned and ran, abandoning her position and racing north across the broken ground. Behind her, she heard more shouting and then return fire. Bullets whining overhead but none coming close. Her lungs burned and her legs pumped desperately as she fled into the darkness. Praying that Hastian had succeeded, she ran until exhaustion forced her to stop, collapsing behind a jumble of rocks and gasping for air. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst from her chest, and her hands shook uncontrollably. She listened for sounds of pursuit, but heard only the wind and her own ragged breathing. Slowly, her panic subsided enough for rational thought to return, and she tried to remember Hastian's instructions about the meeting point. The rock formation he had described was supposed to be visible from high ground. So Rose forced herself upright and began climbing a nearby ridge. Every shadow seemed to hide danger. Every sound made her flinch, but she pushed forward, driven by the need to know if Hastian had survived. When she finally reached the ridge top, she scanned the darkness desperately, looking for the distinctive twin spires Hastian had described. There, to the northeast, she spotted them. Two pillars of stone rising against the stars like silent sentinels. Rose started toward them, moving as quickly as the terrain allowed, and had covered perhaps half the distance when she heard the soft call of a nighthawk. A sound that seemed slightly wrong for the season. She froze, recognizing it as the signal Hastian had taught her, and answered with her own attempt at the call. Shadows detached themselves from the darkness ahead, and Rose nearly sobbed with relief as Hastian materialized, supporting one of the Apache prisoners. Two other figures moved with them, the remaining rescued men, and all of them looked battered but alive. Hastian's eyes found hers across the distance, and even in the darkness she could see the intensity of his gaze. They converged at the rock formation, and Hastian quickly assessed the group. The man he supported had regained consciousness but moved with obvious pain, his face a mask of bruises and cuts. The other two prisoners were in better condition, though both bore signs of brutal treatment. Hastian spoke rapidly to them in Apache, and Rose caught the respect in their voices when they responded, heard her own name mentioned, and saw them look at her with something like wonder. Hastian turned to her and said they needed to move immediately, that the hunters would organize a pursuit as soon as they recovered from their confusion. The rescued men would slow them down, but abandoning them was unthinkable. Rose nodded, too wired with adrenaline to feel the exhaustion that would surely come later. Hastian handed her a water skin and told her to drink. That they had a hard march ahead, they set off into the night. 4 Apache men and 1 white woman, moving through a landscape that seemed to shift and breathe around them. Hastian led them with unerring accuracy despite the darkness, following paths invisible to Rose's eyes. The injured man tried to keep pace but stumbled frequently. And finally Hastian and one of the others took his arms across their shoulders, half carrying him while maintaining their speed. Rose marveled at their endurance. These men who had been beaten and bound, now pushing their bodies beyond what seemed possible. She struggled to keep up, her earlier burst of fear-driven energy beginning to fade. But she refused to be the one who slowed them down. When she stumbled, hands reached out to steady her, and she felt the solidarity of shared danger binding them together. They traveled for hours through the darkness, always moving north and east, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the hunters' camp. Once, they heard distant shouts and saw torches bobbing in the valley below, evidence that pursuit had indeed begun. but Hastian had chosen their route well, and the hunters were searching in the wrong direction. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Hastian finally called a halt in a narrow canyon where a spring provided water and overhanging rocks offered concealment. They collapsed in exhausted heaps, and Rose's legs simply gave out, depositing her in a graceless sprawl on the sandy ground. She was too tired to care, too spent to do anything but lie there and try to remember how to breathe normally. Hastian moved among them, checking injuries and distributing the last of his food when he came to Rose. He knelt beside her with an expression that held gratitude, admiration, and something deeper she could not quite name. He told her that what she had done took courage beyond measure, that she had risked everything for people she did not know, and that his people would remember this. Rose wanted to respond, to tell him it was nothing compared to what he had done for her. But exhaustion claimed her before the words could form. She felt him drape a blanket over her, felt his hand rest briefly on her head in a gesture that felt almost like a blessing. And then sleep pulled her down into darkness. When she woke, the sun was high overhead, and voices speaking in Apache surrounded her. She sat up slowly, every muscle screaming in protest, and found the 3 rescued men sitting with Hastian nearby. Deep in conversation, they fell silent when they noticed her stirring, and all 4 men looked at her with expressions that made her uncomfortable in their intensity. Hastian came to her side and explained that the men wanted to offer their thanks properly, that in their culture, a debt such as this required acknowledgement. The eldest of the 3, a man whose face bore the weathering of many seasons, approached and spoke to her in halting English. He told her his name was Nantai, that she had saved not only their lives but their honor, and that she would always have friends among his people. The formality of his speech and the depth of emotion behind it brought tears to Rose's eyes. She tried to say she had only done what anyone would do, but Nantai shook his head firmly. He told her that many would have done nothing, that many had done nothing in the face of such cruelty, and that her choice to act marked her as someone of rare character. The other men murmured agreement, and Rose felt the weight of their regard settling on her shoulders like a mantle. Hastian translated additional words of gratitude and explained that the men would now travel to rejoin their band, which was camped 3 days' journey to the east. They had invited both Hastian and Rose to come with them, to be received with honor and given rest and supplies. But Hastian had declined on Rose's behalf, knowing she needed to reach her uncle's ranch. The men understood but made Hastian promise to bring her to visit when circumstances allowed. As the men prepared to depart, Nantai approached Rose once more. He reached into a small pouch at his belt and withdrew a small object. Pressing it into her palm, she looked down to find a stone carved in the shape of a bear, smoothed by handling until it gleamed. Nantai told her it had belonged to his father, that it represented strength and protection, and that he wanted her to carry it as a reminder that she would never travel alone. Rose's throat closed with emotion, and she could only nod her thanks. The men embraced Hastian in turn, speaking words she could not understand but whose meaning was clear in their tone and gestures. Then they set off toward the east, moving with renewed purpose despite their injuries. And Rose watched them go until they disappeared into the broken landscape. When she turned back to Hastian, she found him watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. He told her they should rest for the remainder of the day, that they had earned a pause and the hunters would likely give up the search after losing the trail. Tomorrow they would continue north, and with luck, she would reach her uncle's ranch within 3 or 4 days. The mention of their journey's end brought a complicated mix of emotions. Rose had achieved what she set out to do, had crossed dangerous country, and would soon reach safety. But the thought of parting from Hastian filled her with a sadness that went beyond simple gratitude. Over these past days, he had become more than a guide or protector. He had become a teacher, a companion, and something else she did not yet have words for. As if reading her thoughts, Hastian moved to sit beside her. closer than propriety might dictate, but not so close as to presume. He told her that meeting her had changed something in him, had reminded him that connections between people could transcend the divisions that others insisted upon. He said he had spent so long moving alone through the world that he had forgotten what it meant to have someone watch your back, to share burdens and joys, to trust completely. Rose felt tears gathering as he spoke. Knowing he was giving voice to feelings she shared, but had not known how to express, she told him she felt the same. That these days with him had taught her more about strength and courage than all her previous years. She admitted that the thought of saying goodbye made her chest ache in a way she did not fully understand. Hastian reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. And when she did not, his hand found hers. Their fingers intertwined, and Rose felt the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip and the gentleness in his touch. They sat that way as the afternoon light slanted through the canyon. Two people from different worlds who had found unexpected connection in the wilderness. And though neither spoke of what the future might hold, both understood that something profound had formed between them. Something that distance and circumstance might test but could not easily break. The morning air carried the scent of pine as they climbed into the high country. A fragrance so clean and sharp it made Rose's chest expand with something like joy. They had left the rocky plateau behind and entered a realm of towering ponderosas that stood like cathedral pillars, their bark glowing orange in the early light. The ground beneath her boots was soft with fallen needles. And for the first time since the flood, walking felt easy, almost effortless. Hastian moved beside her now rather than ahead. Their pace relaxed enough to allow for conversation. He pointed out edible plants as they walked, showing her the difference between helpful herbs and poisonous lookalikes, teaching her which berries were safe and which would make her violently ill. Rose absorbed the information eagerly, recognizing that each lesson was a gift. Knowledge that could mean survival in future journeys. She asked questions constantly, and Hastian answered with patience that never seemed to waver. Clearly pleased by her genuine interest, they spoke of many things that morning. The changing seasons in this high country, the habits of elk and black bear, the old trails that Hastian's people had traveled for generations before the settlers came. He told her stories of his childhood, learning to track and hunt from his father, listening to his grandfather's tales of a time when the Apache ranged freely across vast territories. There was melancholy in some of these stories, but also pride and a deep connection to memory that Rose found beautiful. She shared her own childhood memories in return, describing her father's ranch and the hard work of maintaining it, the satisfaction of seeing cattle thrive under careful management, the yearly round of branding and drive to market. She spoke of her mother's garden that defied the dry climate through sheer determination, and the way her father would sit on the porch each evening, surveying his modest domain with quiet contentment. Hastian listened with the same attention he brought to everything, asking thoughtful questions that showed he understood the pride and love woven through her words. By midday, they had climbed high enough that the air thinned noticeably, and Rose found herself breathing harder despite the gentle terrain. Hastian called a rest beside a clear stream that tumbled over smooth stones. Its voice musical and soothing, they drank deeply and refilled their water skins. And Rose splashed cold water on her face, washing away the dust and sweat of the morning's travel. As she sat drying her face with her sleeve, Hastian studied the horizon with a concentration that made her turn to look as well. In the distance, perhaps 5 miles away, she could see thin wisps of smoke rising. But these were different from the ominous columns they had seen before. These were smaller, more controlled, the smoke of cookfires and chimneys rather than conflict. Hastian told her that was Evergreen Station, a small settlement that served as a supply point for ranchers and miners in the region. Her uncle's ranch lay another day's travel beyond the station, Hastian explained. but they could stop there to replenish supplies and perhaps get news of the area. Rose felt a flutter of nervousness at the prospect of entering civilization again, of being around people who would surely notice an Apache scout traveling with a white woman and draw conclusions that would not be kind. Hastian seemed to read her thoughts because he told her they could skirt the station if she preferred. Avoid the questions and judgment that their presence together would provoke. Rose surprised herself by refusing. She told him she was tired of hiding, tired of pretending that the friendship between them was something to be ashamed of. If people wanted to stare or whisper, let them. She would walk into that station with her head high and Hastian at her side. And anyone who had a problem with it could keep their opinions to themselves. Hastian smiled at her declaration, a real smile that transformed his usually serious face, and told her she had the heart of a warrior. They approached Evergreen Station in the late afternoon, following a well-worn trail that showed evidence of regular traffic. The settlement consisted of perhaps a dozen buildings clustered around a central trading post. With corrals and outbuildings scattered nearby, smoke rose from several chimneys, and Rose could hear the distant sound of a hammer on an anvil, the everyday music of frontier life. As they entered the town's single street, heads began to turn. A woman hanging laundry stopped mid-motion to stare. A man leading a mule did a visible double-take, and two children playing in the dust froze and then ran toward a nearby building, presumably to tell their parents about the strange sight. Rose kept her eyes forward and her shoulders straight, acutely aware of Hastian's presence beside her and determined to show no shame in it. They approached the trading post, a sturdy log structure with a covered porch where several men sat smoking pipes. The conversation died as Rose and Hastian climbed the steps, and Rose felt the weight of hostile scrutiny like a physical pressure. One of the men, grizzled and hard-eyed, spat tobacco juice in a stream that landed uncomfortably close to Hastian's boots. The insult was deliberate and clear, but Hastian ignored it completely, his face showing nothing as he held the door open for Rose. Inside, the trading post was dim and cluttered, its shelves packed with everything from flour and coffee to tools and ammunition. A heavy-set man behind the counter looked up at their entrance, his expression shifting from welcome to wariness in the space of a heartbeat. He addressed Rose directly while ignoring Hastian entirely, asking what she needed in a tone that suggested her needs were his only concern. Rose felt anger flare hot in her chest at the deliberate slight, but she kept her voice level as she requested supplies: dried meat, cornmeal, coffee, and ammunition for Hastian's rifle. The shopkeeper quoted prices that Rose suspected were inflated, but she paid without argument, wanting only to complete the transaction and leave. As the man gathered the items, he asked her in a voice pitched to carry whether she was traveling of her own free will, whether she needed any assistance or protection. The implication that Hastian might be holding her against her will was so absurd that Rose almost laughed instead. She told the shopkeeper in a voice that rang clear through the store that she was traveling with a friend who had saved her life, who had shown her more kindness and honor than most white men she had known, and whose character far exceeded that of anyone who would judge him by the color of his skin rather than the content of his actions. The silence that followed her statement was profound. The shopkeeper's face reddened, and he shoved the supplies across the counter with unnecessary force. Rose gathered them calmly, thanked him with exaggerated politeness, and turned to leave. Hastian had remained motionless throughout the exchange, but as they reached the door, he placed a hand lightly on her back, a gesture of support that felt more intimate than any words. They emerged onto the porch to find the men still sitting there. Joined now by several others, the atmosphere crackled with tension, and Rose recognized the particular danger of men whose prejudices had been challenged, and who now felt the need to reassert their dominance. The grizzled man who had spat earlier rose slowly, positioning himself to block the stairs. He addressed Hastian directly for the first time. telling him that Apache were not welcome in Evergreen Station, that he should leave immediately and not come back. Hastian met the man's gaze steadily, his voice calm when he spoke. He said they were simply passing through, had no desire for conflict, and would be gone within the hour. The measured response seemed to frustrate the man, who clearly wanted an excuse for violence. He stepped closer, invading Hastian's space in a way designed to provoke. And Rose saw Hastian's hand drift almost imperceptibly toward the knife at his belt. Before the confrontation could escalate further, a new voice cut through the tension. An older woman had emerged from a nearby building, tall and iron-haired, moving with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She told the men to stand down, that there would be no trouble in her town. And the force in her voice made even the grizzled man step back. She introduced herself to Rose as Martha Coulter, owner of the station's boarding house and de facto mayor of Evergreen. Martha's sharp eyes assessed the situation quickly, taking in Rose's travel-worn appearance, the supplies they had purchased, and the protective way Hastian positioned himself slightly between Rose and the hostile men. She asked Rose directly if she needed help, and Rose appreciated that the question was genuine rather than presumptuous. Rose explained briefly about the flood Hastian's rescue, and her journey to her uncle's ranch. Martha listened with attention that felt respectful rather than judgmental. When Rose finished, Martha nodded once and announced to the gathered crowd that these travelers were under her protection for the duration of their stay. Anyone who had a problem with that could take it up with her personally. The steel in her voice and the respect she clearly commanded had the desired effect. The hostile men dispersed slowly, muttering but unwilling to challenge her authority directly. Martha invited them to her boarding house for a proper meal, and Rose accepted gratefully, suddenly aware of how much she missed the simple comfort of sitting at a table. The boarding house was clean and well-maintained, its dining room smelling of fresh bread and stew. Martha served them herself, heaping their plates with generous portions, and as they ate, she asked about their journey with genuine curiosity. Rose found herself telling the story in detail, from the initial terror of the flood to the rescue of the Apache prisoners, to their trek through the high country. Martha listened with expressions that ranged from horror to admiration. And when Rose finished, the older woman sat back and studied them both. She told Rose that she had courage beyond her years, and told Hastian that he was welcome in her establishment any time, regardless of what the narrow-minded fools in town thought. The acceptance from this unexpected source touched Rose deeply, reminding her that goodness and prejudice were not distributed along simple lines. Martha shared news of the area, including word that Rose's uncle was indeed at his ranch and that he had been asking after her, worried when she had not arrived on schedule. The knowledge that she was so close to her destination brought mixed emotions, relief at completing her journey, but also reluctance to reach its end. They left Evergreen Station in the early evening, Martha having provided them with additional supplies and directions to the fastest route to Rose's uncle's ranch. As the settlement disappeared behind them, Rose felt the tension drain from her shoulders. Hastian seemed similarly relieved to be away from the hostile atmosphere, and they walked in comfortable silence as twilight painted the forest in shades of purple and gold. They made camp that night in a meadow where wildflowers nodded in the evening breeze. Hastian built a fire without concern for concealment now that they were in relatively settled territory, and they sat close to its warmth as stars emerged overhead. Rose knew this would likely be their last night together, that tomorrow she would reach her uncle's ranch and Hastian would continue on to wherever his path led him. The knowledge sat heavy in her chest, an ache that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. Hastian seemed to feel it too, because his usual quiet had deepened into something more profound. Finally, as the fire burned low, he spoke of the past days, telling Rose that traveling with her had reminded him of possibilities he had thought lost. He said that somewhere along the trail, between the flood and the rescue, and the countless small moments of connection. She had become important to him in a way that both frightened and exhilarated him. Rose felt tears gathering as he spoke, understanding that he was giving voice to her own unspoken feelings. She told him that leaving him tomorrow would be one of the hardest things she had ever done. That in the space of a few days, he had become essential to her sense of safety and possibility. She admitted that she did not know how to say goodbye to someone who had shown her what it meant to truly trust another person. Hastian moved closer, closing the distance between them with careful deliberation. He reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. His touch feather-light and achingly tender. He told her that goodbyes did not have to be forever, that the world was smaller than it seemed, and that if she wished it, they could find ways to remain connected. Rose asked how, given the realities of their different worlds. And Hastian smiled that rare smile that transformed his features. He told her that his people had ways of moving through the territory unseen, that he could visit her if she was willing to receive him. He said that Martha Coulter's boarding house could serve as a meeting point, that the old woman struck him as someone who understood that friendship transcended the boundaries others tried to impose. The possibility he was offering felt both thrilling and dangerous, a promise of continued connection that would require courage to maintain. Rose agreed without hesitation, telling him she would welcome his visits, that she would find ways to slip away from her uncle's ranch to meet him. They spent the rest of the night making plans, discussing signals and meeting places, building a framework for a future neither could quite imagine, but both desperately wanted. And when exhaustion finally claimed them, they lay near each other by the fire's dying embers, not touching but connected by invisible threads of hope and promise. Morning brought a clarity of light that seemed almost cruel in its beauty. They broke camp slowly, neither wanting to hasten the inevitable separation. The final miles to her uncle's ranch passed too quickly, and suddenly they stood on a ridge overlooking the green valley where buildings and corrals marked human habitation. Hastian pointed out the main house and told Rose he would leave her here, that arriving with him would complicate her reunion unnecessarily. Rose wanted to argue, to insist he come with her, but she knew he was right. Her uncle would be confused and possibly hostile if she arrived with an Apache scout, and the questions would be endless. Better to arrive alone and establish herself before attempting to explain the friendship that had saved and transformed her. She turned to face Hastian, struggling to find words adequate to the moment. He saved her the difficulty by speaking first, telling her that she had given him a gift more valuable than she knew. She had shown him that bridges could be built between worlds if people had the courage to try, that friendship and respect could overcome prejudice and fear. He said he would carry the memory of their journey as a treasure, and that he would find her again as soon as circumstances allowed. Rose embraced him then, propriety abandoned in the face of genuine emotion. She felt his arms close around her, strong and sure, and for a moment, they simply held each other. Two people who had found unexpected connection in the wilderness. When they finally separated, both had tears in their eyes, and Rose pressed the small carved bear Nante had given her into Hastian's hand. She told him to keep it until they met again. A promise made tangible, Hastian accepted the token solemnly, tucking it into his pouch where it would rest near his heart. He told her to be brave, to remember everything she had learned, and to trust that their paths would cross again. Then he turned and melted into the forest with the silent grace that was so uniquely his. And Rose stood alone on the ridge watching the place where he had disappeared. She remained there for a long moment, feeling the weight of all that had transpired settling into her bones. The flood that had nearly killed her had instead become the catalyst for transformation. She was not the same woman who had left Santa Fe weeks ago, driven by stubborn pride and desperate independence. She had learned about true strength, about the wisdom of accepting help, about the courage required to challenge prejudice and defend friendship. Rose turned toward her uncle's ranch and began the descent. her steps steady despite the tumult of emotions in her chest. She carried with her not just the physical scars of her journey, but something more valuable. The knowledge that she was capable of far more than she had believed. And the certainty that somewhere in the wilderness behind her, a friend waited who had shown her what it meant to be truly seen and valued. As she approached the ranch house and saw her uncle emerge onto the porch, shading his eyes against the sun, Rose felt multiple futures branching before her. She could tell him everything or tell him nothing. Could hide her friendship with Hastian or defend it openly. Could return to being the person she was or embrace the person she had become. The choice was hers, and for the first time in her life, she understood that choosing authentically, choosing with courage, was itself a form of freedom. Her uncle hurried toward her, his face showing relief and concern in equal measure. Rose met him halfway, accepting his embrace and his worried questions. And as she began to tell her story, she made a decision. She would speak the truth, all of it, and let the consequences unfold as they would. Because Hastian had taught her that honor mattered more than comfort. That standing up for what was right required risking what was easy. And that some friendships were worth any price. The sun climbed higher over the valley as Rose talked. Her uncle listening with expressions that shifted from shock to disbelief to something that might have been grudging respect. And though the future remained uncertain, though she did not know when or how she would see Hastian again, Rose felt a deep contentment settling into her bones. She had survived the flood, had crossed dangerous country, had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed. And in the process, she had found something more valuable than safety. She had found purpose, connection, and the beginnings of wisdom. The carved bear rested in Hastian's pouch miles away in the forest, and its twin spirit rested in Rose's heart. A promise that some bonds, once forged in fire and water and courage, could never truly be broken. Their story was not ending but transforming, moving from the intensity of shared survival into something deeper and more enduring. And as Rose began her new life in her uncle's valley, she carried with her the certainty that the wilderness had given her gifts that would last a lifetime, and that somewhere in the high country, a friend remembered her and would return.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.